The first panel today is on the theme of designing nations and empire, and each of these papers asks very interesting questions about the contestation around this notion of nation building and really who is building what nation and for what purposes. Everything from contemporary issues to more historical issues. Our first speaker today is Diana Martinez, who is a PhD candidate in architectural history and theory at Columbia University. Her current research on the architecture of the Progressive Era focuses on American architectural interventions abroad, with particular attention paid to the planning and execution of Daniel Burnham's 1905 Master Plan of Manila. She holds a BA in architecture from Berkeley and received a Master's of Architecture from Columbia, where she has taught both design and history courses since graduating in 2006. She has also practiced as an architect in San Francisco, Manila, and New York. And her paper today is called Design and Empire, Daniel Burnham's Master Plan for Manila.
Thank you, David, Laura, and Arif for organizing this discussion. I'm sure there are many of you in this room who realize, many of you thanks to David, that the United States for 50 years had a colony some 8,500 miles away from this fair city. It happened in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. This image shows a defeated Spanish fleet in the burning wake of a steel-sided American Navy. As you can imagine, the United States had a very difficult time trying to justify this fact, considering, of course, that crushing colonialism was this nation's raison d'etre. My paper is really about the lengths that the American government went to make this whole colonialism thing seem okay. In President McKinley's words, the abandonment of the Western Hemisphere by Spain was an imperative necessity. It was not compatible with the assurance of permanent peace on and near our own territory, that the Spanish flag should remain on this side of the sea. This lesson of events and reason left no alternative as to Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands belonging to Spain in this hemisphere. The Philippines, however, stand on a different basis. It is nonetheless true that without any original thought of complete or even partial acquisition, the presence and success of our arms at Manila imposes upon us obligations which we cannot disregard. The march of events rules and overrules human action. Incidental to our tenure in the Philippines is the commercial opportunity to which American statesmanship cannot be indifferent. It is just to use every legitimate means for the enlargement of American trade. With an astonishing and imperious frankness, President McKinley explained to the American public exactly why they took as a spoil of war a distant and unknown archipelago. The Americans, initially presenting themselves as allies to a hastily gathered Filipino nationalist revolutionary militia, soon found themselves at war not only with them, but with hundreds of other unaffiliated insurgent groups. Casualties resulting from what the Americans considered not a war, but an insurrection were heavy. I do not really have the time to get into the very complicated details of this struggle, but let it suffice to say that it was brutal and bloody. Filipino civilian deaths were estimated to be as high as 1.5 million, most of those resulting from the reconcentration of large numbers of the archipelago's natives catching disease in tight and unsanitary conditions. Eager to erase the stubborn stain of the ongoing Philippine insurgents, Governor General Taft, as in the future President Taft, requested that Burnham, fresh from his ideologically clarifying renovation of Washington, D.C., to endow the archipelago with an undimmed image of liberty. Burnham heartily accepted. At first, Burnham's Manila plan seems to contain many of the elements of his other City Beautiful plans, but if we look closer, we discover some very unique approaches. To begin with, Burnham was not, as he was in American cities, attempting to reorganize the unruly appearance of a laissez-faire industrial order. Burnham instead encountered the paradoxically new problem of history. At the dawn of the 20th century, Manila was a centuries-old city that predated even Spanish conquest in the 16th century. By contrast, Washington, D.C. was barely 100 years old, Cleveland and Chicago much younger. But perhaps presenting the most solemn challenge to the planner was the fact that at Manila he was charged with the absurd task of ideologically positioning his American plan against empire itself. Burnham had only a few years before he arrived in Manila traveled with the rest of the Washington Park Committee on an educational tour of Europe's great cities, including the recently transformed cities of Paris and Vienna. It is well known that the revolutionary events of 1848 were followed by a spat of urban reforms, where the reactionary monarchs Franz Joseph and Napoleon III aimed to restore monarchical potency. Franz Joseph issued his famous decree to tear down Vienna's city walls and fill in its stagnant moat to create its famous Ringstrasse. Burnham quoted directly from his experiences upon finding a moat in Manila, and proposed a transformation of the moat surrounding Intramuros, now stagnant and hazardous to health, to provide a useful and pleasant park. Oh, sorry. So here you can see the park surrounding the old walled city. This is it. Vienna's wall and moat, which for centuries protected the Austrian aristocracy from the invading Turkish Empire. This was ineffective against the various threats emerging from within its own territory. Similar to Vienna's experience, America's demonstrated naval supremacy in the Spanish-American War outmoded the functionality of the city walls, and threats from the direction of the colonial interior would be addressed by other civilizing means, which I will be returning to shortly. Unlike Franz Joseph, Burnham did not destroy the old city walls. Burnham recognized Intramuros as having historical and, quote, archaeological value as one of the few remaining examples of a medieval fortified town, unquote. Despite the historical interest of the walls, Burnham argued prevented the free flow of traffic. Thus he proposed that they could be pierced with an occasional gateway that would permit passage without destroying the monumental effect. An unwillingness to destroy history distinguishes Burnham's work from the more extreme moves of Franz Joseph or Haussmann. The lack of an American architectural tradition and the youth of its monuments were some of the anxieties that motivated America's adoption of the neoclassical. So when Burnham encountered actual history, an imperious nostalgia held sway. The occasional piercing of the walls, however, neutralized the fortress's function, at the same time that it held in place an image of a less civilized form of control, leaving the walls of Intramuros to stand as a museum piece of a formidable, though decidedly more barbaric imperialism. Burnham's next move was to place an almost exact replica in miniature of Washington, D.C.'s Lafayette Square, adjacent to the walled city, which you can see here. Surrounding this square would be a district of government buildings. This adjacency, a study in contrast, offered Burnham a way out of the American imperial contradiction, giving form to what could now appear as a relatively enlightened American imperialism. An ideologically fraught construction legally codified in the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, a corollary that extended American interests from the protection of its immediate territories to include the, quote, interests of all humanity and the suppression of a, quote, recrudescence of barbarism. The recrudescence of barbarism here did not refer to the archipelago's natives, who existed on an even lower order of savagery, but rather to the lapsed gatekeepers of civilization, Spain. A Spain that for the most part languished in the dark shadows cast by the Continental Enlightenment. In penning the Roosevelt Corollary, the president was drawing upon a long literary tradition, on a genre that would come to be known as the leyenda negra. Identified as a type of historical writing that demonized the conquistadors and the Spanish Empire in a politically motivated attempt to morally disqualify Spain as a ruler over its subjects, especially her subjects in the New World and in the Philippines. This often fantastical discourse, represented here in an engraving by Theodore Debris, which shows a Spanish conquistador feeding the body of a baby to dogs, was born out of a long and antagonistic relationship between the Spanish church and the Spanish state, a conflict that was especially concentrated in the colonies, where the competition for souls was at odds with the empire's commercial imperatives. It was against this black legend, represented in space by the foreboding and gray acropolis of Intramuros, that the White City, the metaphorical capital of the New World, was most poised to make an ideological claim, substituting supposedly sacred and inviolable principles with a sublime chiaroscuro. Burnham was not the first builder to attempt to undermine the symbols of Spanish power. As I have already mentioned, ecclesiastical power had undermined the influence of the Spanish crown in the Philippines long before the Spanish-American War. This points toward an important structural difference between Spanish and U.S. rule, which laid in their respective relationships to religion. America's difficult unification necessarily excluded religious affiliation, while the indeterminate relationship between church and state in Spain, and especially in Spain's colonies, was a long, ongoing conflict. Though many Filipino subjects had acquiesced sovereignty to the United States, the American campaign to win Filipino hearts and minds would be frustrated by the still resident Catholic friars' sway over souls. The project of unification would require Filipinos put allegiance before faith and be citizens before they were parishioners. Thus, Americanization would also necessarily be a process of religious conversion. The Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost were to be replaced by the new and concrete blessings of mass education, economic development, and democratic government. Fittingly, the respective architectural strategies of the old church and the new state were remarkably similar. Here we have two excerpts from Philip II's Law of the Indies. Two excerpts, one from Philip II's Law of the Indies, which outlined every facet of creating a colonial community, and a quote from Burnham describing his own plan. So this one is from the Law of the Indies. In inland towns, the church is to be on the plaza, but at a distance from it, in a situation where it can stand by itself, separate from other buildings, so that it can be seen from all sides. It can thus be made more beautiful, and it will inspire more respect. It would be built on high ground, so that in order to reach its entrance, people will have to ascend a flight of steps. Compare this with Burnham's own statements about the programmatic function of his plan. Diagonal arteries radiated from the civic core to all the outlying sections. Such an arrangement would be entirely fitting for both practical and sentimental reasons. Practical, because the center of governmental activity should be readily accessible from all sides. Sentimental, because every section of the capital city should look with deference toward the symbol of the nation's power. The view from all sides common to both strategies was in direct opposition to the way the walls of Intramuros operated. That is, not by threat or exclusion, but through a receptivity. This was a practice that demonstrated the Americans' ready ability in psychosociological manipulation, an ability to manipulate colonial subjects that was already demonstrated in the time of the Spanish colonizers. Manfredo Tafuri once described Spanish colonial cities as machines for conversion. Burnham borrowed from the strategies of the church and the Spanish colonial state by first penetrating neighborhoods with the axes of surveillance. The gaze out was still possible from atop the high ground of the neutered walls, then by directing that unified gaze back towards a single luminous focal point. This combined strategy outlines the critical difference between the old and the proposed Manila. Under Spain, a dialectical relationship existed between the two competing methods of control, the church and the colonial state, while power under the Americans had a single reference point, the complex of monuments to a new civic religion. Under the Spanish, egregious abuses were committed by both church and state. This was the milieu out of which developed a Philippine revolutionary consciousness. That is, in the battle for control over subjects, a desire for self-determination emerged. Though this desire was, I would argue, limited to a small and educated Filipino elite. Burnham's strategy aimed to diffuse nationalist and any other insurrectionist momentum by precluding the possibility of an exteriority through the production of an image of an enchanting and organic wholeness. A coherent and orderly image, in fact, was the only agenda of the City Beautiful movement. Indeed, it is the only substantive mutual objective between Burnham's domestic work and his work in Manila. The heightening of the difference between a despotic history and the promise of an institutional democracy displaced the City Beautiful's domestic imperative to reclaim the city from unchecked industrial growth by reasserting state power. But the key to understanding the double logics of American colonialism is demonstrated in an almost unnoticeable detail in Burnham's grand plan. Off-axis, west of the proposed civic center, tucked in a peculiar corner condition, was a small area reserved exclusively for American programs. This location was more strategic than formally determined. That is to say that despite its lack of pride of place in plan, it was actually the best piece of real estate on the island, commanding an uninterrupted view of the spectacular Manila sunset, able to directly intercept incoming investors, most of them American, directly from the bay, and located on a lushly planted boulevard that linked Manila to its outlying areas. In addition to this, views of the site were obscured from the rest of the city by its placement behind the hulking mass of Intramuros. You can see that you wouldn't be able to see this site from behind this sort of dark acropolis. The construction of the centerpiece of Burnham's plan, a convergence of civic buildings upon a lawn terminating in a domed capitol, would not be the first order of business for William Parsons, the Beaux-Arts-trained architect that Burnham chose to execute his plan. Instead, the first buildings to descend upon the newly planted mall occupied this peculiar beachfront corner condition reserved for American use. They were the opulently appointed government-owned Manila Hotel, completed in 1909, and its immediate neighbors, the Army-Navy Club, and its sister, the Elks Club, both completed in 1911. The clubs and hotel were built to support an American population, quote, used to better conditions. On this project in particular, Parsons worked with great urgency. Parsons, who for the purposes of this paper serves as a minor figure, worked under the auspices of one William Cameron Forbes, a man of remarkable mixed pedigree, the grandson of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Frances Blackwell Forbes, the son of William Hathaway Forbes. Forbes, who in his early 30s was put in charge of the family bank, felt unsatisfied with his lot in life and wanted desperately to follow in the groundbreaking footsteps of his ancestors, to embody the myth of the self-made man by doing what he considered to be the world's work. In 1904, Forbes left for the Philippines, where he would first serve as a commissioner of police, and then as the island's 5th governor general, a post he would hold from 1909 to 1913. During his tenure, Forbes focused his efforts on programs that would make the Philippines more hospitable to foreign investors. Accordingly, he treated with urgency the completion of the aforementioned clubs, the Manila Hotel, his pet project, the Manila Polo Club, and a world-class golf course, which was placed in the filled-in moat Burnham had intended to be a public park. Curiously, the architecture of these various clubs was far more exotic than Burnham would have ever preferred. Everything from the wicker furniture to the hanging baskets of prehistorically large flora spoke of a tropicalia that was at once both decadent and domesticated. Forbes, unlike Burnham, lived in the Philippines for almost a decade and, as such, understood the beauty and demands of the Philippine climate. Forbes chose to build the hotel and clubs in a Spanish colonial style with deep verandas and overhanging roofs, more suited to the climate than Burnham's preferred Beaux-Arts manner. Forbes' beloved polo club was really just a gigantic nipa hut, or bahay kubo, a pre-colonial vernacular type that provided for excellent natural ventilation. You can see this is the gigantic bahay kubo. Beyond considerations of comfort, the use of the native styles infused the American experience with a sense of adventure and romantic colonial ambiance. These hospitality programs were necessary to convince potential investors of the stability of the Philippine situation. Not an easy task, as the continued rebellion, especially in the Philippine South, were on account of an active anti-imperialist league in the U.S., led by Mark Twain and William Jennings Bryan, well publicized. Hospitality, Forbes understood, went hand in hand with business. Like his grandfather before him, Emerson, Forbes heard the whistle of the locomotive in the woods and understood its prophetic announcement of, quote, real estate in the swamp and wilderness. But Forbes, unlike Emerson, was not a literarily gifted observer, but rather a man with means born into an age of steel and machines, who understood that development did not come without significant financial backing. Forbes's patrilineal line was, after all, not populated by early industrialists, but by bankers. Business, Forbes believed, was the linchpin of progress. As he states in his 1921 publication, The Romance of Business, quote, the service rendered by steel, electricity, and transportation has been made possible only through the system of banks and currency that has grown inseparable. Forbes's initial focus on hospitality programs was merely he might lead us to believe, or he might have actually believed, the preliminary, though necessary step towards a broad-based material improvement on the islands. Once the comfort of investors was ensured, Forbes occupied himself with his stated intention of, quote, improving the Filipinos' condition, a goal that did not include prioritizing the building of Burnham's ideological dress, which embodied, after all, what Forbes felt to be an outdated and abstract American principles, based on outdated and abstract American principles. On a trip to India, Forbes noted in his journal, if I wanted to see the sights of India, I'd go to the great irrigation works, to the schools and the colleges, and see things doing and growing, and leave out temples and historic spots where people did things creditable or otherwise many years ago. That is to say, despite his own predilections for a relaxed native style, and despite his personal and professional attachment to Burnham, neither history nor context held sway over Forbes, and accordingly, the building of Burnham's ideological plan would be forestalled by the completion of the ports, bridges, roads, and tall buildings that would guarantee more definite progress in the form of, quote, tangible benefits for the Filipinos. Indeed, the city of Manila today is much more a product of Forbes than it was of Burnham's. By 1940, Manila was really three cities: Intramuros, the city of a colonial ambiance; Burnham's White City, the city of American benevolence; and the dense and now sprawling Tondo, the city of foreign investment, of global capital, of material progress. This city was in fact birthed from Burnham's sweet little back room on Manila Bay that we saw earlier. Here in the frontispiece to Forbes's book, The Romance of Business, a family of savages observes as a towering metropolis emerges above billowy clouds, themselves foregrounded by a rustic American landscape. The metropolis approaches a scraggly island and the primitive hut. This romance is hardly consonant with a European tradition that pined for a pre-industrial past, nor was it a part of an even longer Virgilian tradition that counterposed the complex city to the uncomplicated life of the pastoral. This was rather a positive reaffirmation of the path that progress, now stripped of its ideological pretenses, had already taken. That itself serves as a justification for its complex and advancing horizon. Rail, skyscraper, roads, and the machine form the collective image of the new American sublime, a rapid and astonishing growth that Filipinos could observe in the making. I conclude with this proleptic image. Burnham City was eventually built, but only after 1935, when the United States officially granted the Philippines its independence following a 10-year transition period, which I argue elsewhere not so coincidentally coincided with the advent of World War II and the destruction of America's own Potemkin City.
Thank you, Diana. Okay, so our next speaker is Azra Dawood. Let me just make sure that this is coming up. Great. Is Azra Dawood, who is a first-year PhD student in MIT's History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art program at the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture. She previously graduated with an MArch degree from MIT in 2010, and the intervening year she was the SOM Foundation's Travel and Research Fellow. She has previously worked as an architect in New York, and she has a Bachelor's of Architecture from UT Austin. Her paper today is titled Egypt by Design, the Architecture of the New Egyptian Museum and Research Institute at Cairo.
Thank you. So I'll present an American project that was proposed for Egypt during a very specific and complicated political period in the country, in the region. So I'd like to begin with a quick historical overview. In 1922, the British created a constitutional monarchy in Egypt to appease the Egyptian nationalist movement. But the Egyptian parliament had limited autonomy because the British army was still stationed in Cairo, and the French still controlled the Egyptian Antiquities Service. So this state of affairs continued until 1952 and the Free Officers' Revolution. So basically we have a couple of, we have really 6 political actors in Egypt negotiating with each other. We have the army, the French, the Egyptian king, the Egyptian nationalists, the Egyptian parliament. I think it's 5. But to begin, in 1926, the premier American Egyptologist James Brusted presented Egypt's King Fuad I with plans for a new Egyptian museum and research institute at Cairo, proposed for Cairo. Stunning watercolor drawings illustrated a neo-Pharaonic, neoclassical Beaux-Arts complex that would replace the existing Egyptian museum, which you see here on the top, and that would replace the existing Egyptian museum built by the British and French in 1902. Brusted was the project's mastermind. He had secured the support of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who pledged $10 million to the museum's construction and endowment, and the services of his personal architect, William Wells Bosworth, for its design. The Egyptian parliament subjected this generous gift to a series of negotiations, ultimately rejecting it. Publicly, the U.S. team blamed the failure of the project on Egyptian vanity, on Oriental mistiness, and suspicious nationalism. The archives, however, demonstrate otherwise. My larger research uses the Brusted-Rockefeller team's correspondence to demonstrate that the failed museum was actually an imperial project presented, in the words of Brusted, as a gift of science from the great democracy of the West to an Egypt desirous of independence from European empires at the end of the First World War. So capitalizing on the United States' image as a benevolent empire, the ambitious Brusted sought to channel Arab goodwill towards the U.S. into a political and archaeological opportunity for his country and himself. In 1919, in a letter addressed to Rockefeller shortly after President Wilson's departure for the Paris Peace Conference, which marked the end of the First World War, Brusted wrote, quote, so he's the man on the left, and he wrote, for the first time in history, the birthlands of religion and civilization, Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, Assyria, and Babylonia have suddenly become ours. The study of these lands is the birthright and legacy of all civilized people. Their delivery from the Turk brings to us an opportunity never seen before. Our allies in Europe are financially exhausted. This makes both the opportunity and the obligation all the greater for us in America." End quote. So this paper examines the aesthetic visualization of this opportunity and obligation in the proposed museum's architecture, interior layout, and urban placement. Brusted sought to challenge French and British control via an innovative strategy that combined the administrative and spatial displacement of existing imperial authorities. Challenging France's archaeological protectorate, he proposed to create a private philanthropic corporation for the new museum to be controlled this time by an alliance of Western archaeologists and museums with only token Egyptian representation. Furthermore, the new museum would be located, furthermore, the new museum would be located on the site of the British Army's Qasr al-Nil barracks. So that's the Nile, those are the British barracks, and that's the British and French-built Egyptian Museum, which is still the museum today. And then the American Museum would have gone here, right there. And Tahrir Square is down here. So the new museum would be located on the site of the British Army's Qasr al-Nil barracks in what is today Tahrir Square, thereby symbolically replacing British military authority with US benevolence. Now, although the British and French would participate in this cooperation, ultimate control lay with the American Board of Trustees. The Egyptian government was asked to hand over its antiquity to this American corporation for 33 years in the name of scientific management. But the project failed when it would succeed in later modified iterations elsewhere, can be attributed to the lack of US power against still entrenched European empires at this early date, as well as to rising Egyptian nationalism, which identified the proposal as an imperial project and which, following in the footsteps of Western powers, had begun to recognize the political value of Egyptian antiquity. Now, although the breasted Rockefeller project, this sort of private philanthropic project, is largely unknown today, had it succeeded, it would have established American control over Egyptian antiquities and American presence in Egypt as early as the 1920s. And this is, so to see why this is significant, it was a time of political isolationism when this project would have taken place. So these political motivations are evident in the museum's proposed design. I will show that in choosing the neoclassical, neo-Pharaonic Beaux-Arts style over the prevalent Islamic revival architecture, which was associated with local Egyptians, the US team sought to deny the claim of the country's local inhabitants to Egyptian antiquity. I contend that the failure and fallout of this strategy, in turn, had architectural implications for Egypt, which I'll get to at the end. So from the beginning, Breasted envisioned a design and site that could evoke permanence. In 1924, he wrote to Rockefeller, quote, "Under this land, the limestone lies 30 or 40 feet deep. Rising on imperishable piers of concrete, on this limestone, the new museum should adorn this square, a structure as enduring as the pyramids themselves. It makes my blood tingle to think of it, even in imagination." End quote. Comparing the new museum with the ancient pyramids, Breasted imagined it as a monument to the emerging US civilization, one that would replace the existing museum, which was a monument to European control of Egyptology and Egypt. But it maintained a continuity with the European Museum in that, in the manner of its European predecessor, the Breasted Rockefeller Museum proposed to continue the division of Egyptian culture by excluding Egypt's modern Arab history. So by way of explaining this point, I'll summarize the work of the historians Donald Reed and Donald Preziosi have written about this. And they have shown that the 1902 Egyptian Museum was conceived as part of a larger European program in which around 1900, Egypt's material culture was sort of classified into 4 distinct civilizations by the creation of 4 separate museums in Egypt. So you have the Coptic Museum, and the Museum of Arab Art, the Greco-Roman Museum, which was in Alexandria, the others were in Cairo, and then the Egyptian Museum itself. Now, each museum was in an urban location and an architectural style that was deemed appropriate to its contents. So the Egyptian Museum is located in Cairo's so-called European quarters, which are right here, and then the Museum of Arab Art is located right here in the sort of organic part of Cairo. So together, the museum's neoclassical Beaux-Arts style and its location in Tahrir Square presented the British and French as responsible guardians of Egyptian antiquity and, by extension, Egypt herself. Only 20 years later, Breasted would describe this monument to European supremacy in Egyptology as structurally unstable, crowded, and hostile to science. So those are his words. Rockefeller's architect would describe the building grotesquely ugly. And in comparison to this dilapidated museum, the proposed American design was undeniably grand, largely because of Rockefeller's financial backing. So before the team chose the Beaux-Arts scheme, it briefly debated the merits of an Islamic or an Islamic revival style. In a letter to Bosworth, Breasted suggested the 14th century Sultan Hassan Mosque and the 19th century Muhammad Ali mosques as historically and architecturally significant examples of the Islamic style in Cairo. Both mosques incorporate foreign and hybrid architectural elements for their time, demonstrating not just the complexity and elasticity of an Islamic style, but also the wide reach of pre-European Egyptian dynasties. So I don't have time to explain today, but for the periods that these mosques belong to, these are actually quite hybrid historical styles. And then furthermore, at the time of the museum proposal, the prevalent architectural style in Egypt was an Islamic revival style, or what's also known as a Neo-Mamluk style. And that was actually a European invention or creation of an appropriate aesthetic for local Egyptian or Arab buildings. So you have the Museum of Arab Art, and then you have the Awqaf Ministry building, but purely, buildings that were considered to be purely European, for example, the British and French-built Egyptian Museum were not in this style. As an unabashed Beaux-Arts neoclassicist, which is how Bosworth described himself, Bosworth no doubt steered the team away from the Islamic revival, drawing inspiration instead from his own past designs, such as the one for MIT. The Beaux-Arts style, derived from the teachings of the French École des Beaux-Arts, was enormously popular with American architects and patrons. Within a general neoclassical aesthetic, the style emphasized spatial hierarchy, strong axis, and logical circulation that allowed creative freedom with the use and placement of ornaments from different regions and historical periods. So such a synthesis resulted in a cosmopolitan style which Bosworth deemed desirable for the United States, and in his words, with the international interests of its wealthiest sons such as Rockefeller, the US could in fact appropriate all styles. That the Islamic revival style was not used, though it too could incorporate cosmopolitan ornaments and elements, is indicative of the team's rejection of what the style had come to represent, that's Egypt's modern-day inhabitants. The new museum's proposed design does not even incorporate any Islamic ornaments. Rather, neo-Pharaonic ornaments and paintings embellish the buildings, but they're subsumed within a larger neoclassical aesthetic. That the neoclassical should frame the ancient Egyptian spirit demonstrates the Western narrative of Greco-Roman origins that remained entrenched. On the inside, the strict layout of the museum complemented or perhaps demanded a prescribed clockwise movement through the building. So to paraphrase Breasted, visitors would survey man's development, beginning with the Stone Age civilization. So what you would basically do, and he wrote about this, is that you enter the museum, you turn left, go into the Stone Age section, up through successive ages of Egyptian civilization, recent discoveries from Tutankhamun's tomb, the height of Egyptian civilization, down to the decline of Egyptian civilization, the rise of Greco-Roman, the rise of Christian Egypt. And he said the rise of the monuments, he would end with the monuments of Christian Egypt, which resulted in, as he put it, Western leadership of civilization, and then you basically exit. So there's no room here for Egypt's modern population, so there's no room here for the Arab civilization, or for the Muslim civilization. So the omission of Egypt's Islamic history from this narrative is also evident in this view here, where we see the museum and research institute together, so that the large building is a museum and then that's the research institute. They both engage the waterfront in the manner of ancient temples, but they turn their backs onto the complexities of modern Cairo, which is represented by an indistinct background. So this museum really could be anywhere. And in fact, Rockefeller had initially at the beginning of the project suggested, well, why don't we buy the antiquities and bring them to a museum in the West? The Breasted Rockefeller team's worldview is visible in a final piece of the museum's aesthetic strategy. It was destined for Tahrir Square. by physically displacing the British barracks and building over the site and next to the existing French-run museum, further emphasizing its obsoleteness. The Americans wished to appear sympathetic to Egyptian interests. In Bosworth's words, the barracks site was their trump card. The drawings were made with this site in mind. But prior to presenting the project this is just kind of a working drawing that they did. So that's the French museum, barracks, and the proposed museum. But prior to presenting the project to the Egyptian king, the Americans entered into negotiations with the British Army, entreating them to participate in what they termed was Anglo-American cooperation against the Mohammedan nations. But after initially agreeing to relocate its barracks, the British Army refused, and the museum's proposed site was moved to an island in the Nile across from Tahrir. So that's the Nile. There was an island here, the Jazeera, and then they said that they would move the museum here. The team's overall political strategy was no doubt evident to all parties involved. Both the British Army and the French did not support the project, and Egypt's Prime Minister Zafar Pasha declared it an infringement, quote, upon the sovereignty of Egypt, end quote. The project's failure caught the Breasted Rockefeller team off guard. They were pretty confident of success, and they had printed 5,000 copies of their proposal book, which they planned to send to archaeologists and world leaders after the museum had been accepted. So they must have been equally surprised when Israel found architectural expression only a couple of years later in an unprecedented reappropriation of the neo-Pharaonic aesthetic. In 1927, the death of Egypt's nationalist leader Saad Zaghloul prompted a debate over the design of his proposed mausoleum. The Egyptian architect Mustafa Fehmi presented two design options: a prevalent Islamic revival and a neo-Pharaonic design. Prior to Bosworth's proposal for the new Egyptian museum, there was little precedence in Cairo for the neo-Pharaonic, which was mostly this sort of Western style. And there are only 3 surviving examples of it in Cairo from that period. In all 3, the neo-Pharaonic influence is limited to ornament. In fact, Bosworth's proposed design for the new Egyptian museum displays the most elaborate use of such neo-Pharaonic elements. Despite some protests over the un-Islamic character of the mausoleum's neo-Pharaonic proposal, which you see here, ultimately the style prevailed, ushering in a brief era of neo-Pharaonism in Egyptian architecture that lasted until the 1930s. The style emerged as a neutral metaphor for nationalism. Nationalist leaders encouraged neo-Pharaonism in both thought and aesthetics to unite Muslims and Coptic Christians behind Egypt's nationalist struggle. I suggest that the publicity generated by the rejection of the new Egyptian museum just prior to the mausoleum's design had some influence in the latter's architectural style. Egypt's rejection of the museum and its reappropriation of the neo-Pharaonic architectural style in Saad Zaghloul's mausoleum was a moment of nationalist triumph. But I'd like to end by saying that I don't want to present the failure of the American proposal as an unmitigated victory for Egyptian nationalism. Rather, I think it helps explain the sudden emergence of the neo-Pharaonic style in Egypt in that period, which has never been linked to the failed museum. And it shows that archaeology and architecture were the only arenas available at this time for both the nascent American empire and the Arab nation state. And these sort of soft victories in the face of still entrenched European powers were significant because they were also the only ones that were possible at the time. So, thank you.
There's already some terrific ways in which there are overlapping themes in these presentations, which is really helpful to see. Okay, great. Our next speaker is Luis Rodriguez, who's the head of Design Theory and Processes Department at Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Cuauhtémoc in Mexico. He has collaborated with small and medium-sized firms, developing products and business strategies, and has written 5 books on design theory and design history, and numerous articles in both national and international magazines. And his paper today is titled The 1968 Olympics as a Symbol of Social and Student Protests Throughout the World.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. I'd like to give you, first of all, a bit of introduction to this work. In 1968, just as a background, there was not a graphic design school in Mexico. So at that time, graphic design was developed by either architects or graphic artists in general. The first school of graphic design opened in Mexico just after the Olympic Games. So this is a date where there is a turning point, not only in political, but also in terms of graphic design in the history of Mexico. So this is just as a brief introduction. 1968 is a synonym of social and student protest throughout the world. 1968 in Mexico represents two major events, the 19th Olympic Games and the students' movement that started a political change that resulted in today's definition of Mexico's political system. Both events were supported by outstanding graphics. The purpose of this presentation is to show the contrast between two approaches to visual communication. One representing the aspiration of the establishment that wanted to convey an image of modernism and development, and the other pursuing to communicate to a vast majority the need to reject the idea of modern, signified by the official graphics of the Olympic Games in Mexico. As a background, in Mexico, during the revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, that's 1910 to 1920, there was an artist, Jose Guadalupe Posada, who produced these engravings. This was the only way, really, to communicate political criticism to the masses. The others were forbidden by the political system. So not only the graph of Posada, but also the political importance of his work is really a background and has made a profound impact in Mexico. In 1937, the Workshop for Popular Graphic Art was founded at a time when socialism was the prevailing political orientation in Mexico. With the support of different intellectual groups and known artists as the founders of the muralist movement, especially Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros, much of the work developed at this workshop took as a starting point the tradition of engraving and devoted their work to support popular causes and the political orientation of left-wing workers' union. They followed the tradition of engraving that originated in Posada's work. This is going to be mainly a visual presentation. "1968 is remembered as a particular complex year in terms of political unrest throughout the world. Students led different conflicts in many different countries, most of them demanding a radical change in education and against the then called establishment. Mexico was no exception, and students held several protests that were violently repressed by the government. But this happened just a few weeks from the opening of the Olympic Games. For the Olympic Games, the government started an ambitious program whose main object was to convey an image of modernity, since Mexico was the first developing country to host the Olympic Games. The graphic design program was developed by Eduardo Terrazas and Lance Wyman. They made a good use of the then prevailing op art and the principles of modern design, together with an extensive use of a color palette that was developed by the Mexican architect Luis Barragan and that was adopted by many as part of the Mexican identity. That's the development of the main logo of the Olympic Games. And these are examples of several uses, typography, the typography that was developed, some of the signs and the tickets and post stamps that were developed by the team led by Terrazas and Wyman. This is a sort of graphic art that was never seen before in Mexico. It was really violent, if we could say it in a good term. It was a violent eruption of the Mexican tradition. On the other hand, the students produced a graphic work that was not made by professionals and that had to be done without economic support. Most of this work, following the tradition started by Posada and that was continued by the workshop of popular graphic art, a common trend was the irony based on the official graphics for the Olympic Games. On the left, we have a design of a dove, signifying peace, of course, and then this was the use that was developed by the students. The official visual communication was designed by Lance Wyman and Eduardo Terrazas and was the result of a well-balanced mixture of op and pop art and the functionalism of the modern movement. The graphics of the message from the students and intellectuals was a mixture of traditional forms inherited from the muralist painting and a clever use of scarce resources and the need to produce graphics in a manner suited to the repressive atmosphere that prevailed at that time. That's the official graphics, and that's the interpretation. The graphics for the Olympic Games gave birth to graphic design as a profession, since the first school of graphic design in Mexico started in 1968 using the impulse of the work developed for the Olympic graphics. On the other hand, protests gave birth to a political awareness that eventually changed the political system of Mexico. Today, we still remember that date, October the 2nd of 1968, because that was the date when the government made a very violent repression and killed several students. So it's an important date in the political system in Mexico. So October the 2nd is really a turning point in every sense in Mexico. Then we used, in the political movement, we used some images like that one that was during the Olympic Games when a group of American athletes received the gold medal and they denied to look and listen to the American anthem and to look at the flag going up. And they protested in that way. And then this was used using the same language that was developed by Wyman and Terrazas in other media. These are examples of some of the work developed by intellectuals and students, very much in the tradition that came from the revolution, from Posada, and then the workshop of popular art, and then this sort of work. That had to be done very quickly from one day to another. And it had to be done very cheaply. There were no economic support. And they were destroyed immediately by the government. So it's been kind of difficult to recover some of these examples for us in Mexico. The graphics for the Olympic Games gave birth to graphic design as a profession, since the first school of graphic design in Mexico started in 1968 using the impulse of the work developed for the Olympic graphics. On the other hand, protest gave birth to a political awareness that eventually changed the political system of Mexico. These are more recent examples of graphic design. I think we have come to a union of different trends in graphic design. We still carry some of the tradition of the former artists, Posada and the rest, especially with the use of a very high contrast, very cheap means of production. We don't have very subtlety in the work, but then there is a more, say, so to speak, a more professional work. That one's the one at the top is still a very late example, and then we have some modern ones that still remember the use of the graphics of the Olympic Games and the way they were changed by the students. We have examples at that time of the poster, and then how the work of Lance Wyman carried on in Mexico. He also developed the logo and the signs for the subway system, the metro system in Mexico City, and many other professional works. He's been a very well-known graphic artist in Mexico. He understands very well the use of color in Mexico, so we identify with this kind of color very easily. We recognize this as part of our identity. We still carry on with this ironic feeling towards the establishment of the political system. Again, the poster on the right again remembers the October the 2nd. There were different groups of graphic designers, now graphic designers, that carry on with some of this work. And now we have some examples of modern posters in Mexico. We can still see some of the main issues that remain as an identity. For instance, the high contrast with figures. Some of them could be just black and white, and then the splash of color. And political manifestations carry on with more or less the same tradition, but using a more professional work. Nowadays we have over 150 graphic schools of design, graphic design schools in Mexico, and it is a big boom. It is a profession with a huge demand. There are many graphic designers going to the market every day, but there is still a group who persists with this political idea. And now that the political system has changed in Mexico and we can express ourselves more freely, we have the support of graphic designers with a more political awareness, and they also pay tribute to the tradition that we come from. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Luis. Our next paper is going to be given by David Chiarlo. David is currently an assistant professor of modern European history at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2003 and has taught at MIT and the University of Cincinnati. His first book, Advertising Empire, Race and Visual Culture in Imperial Germany, came out in 2011 with Harvard University Press and offers a visual history of advertising and of a commercialized colonial culture in Germany from the 1880s to the 1920s. This book won the American Historical Association's George Louis Beer Prize in 2012. David's paper today is titled Designing German Colonial Power, Advertising an Empire in Germany circa 1900.
I'd like to add my thanks to the organizers for organizing such an incredibly stimulating conference. My talk today is it's a good balance with Luis's because where he looks at the sort of graphic of liberation, mine looks a little bit more at the graphics of power in an earlier period. My talk today draws from the recent book, Advertising Empire, Race and Visual Culture. The book itself is a visual history, and it argues a bunch of things, but in broad terms, it argues that advertising, around the turn of the century, between 1880 and 1914, advertising in Germany built its own empire, in part by advertising empire to Germans. Right around 1900, a figure began to appear across the visual landscape of Germany. This figure is that of the African native. It was an increasingly prominent motif in the emerging world of visual advertising that swept across Germany at the fin de siècle. As a commercial illustration, the figure gazed down from posters on the sides of buildings or kiosks, or stood behind printed text of the daily news in an advertising insert, or was carried back into the homes on the new chromolithographed tin and cardboard packaging. Usually clad only in a grass skirt, or a leaf skirt, or else wearing striped shorts, this figure was often depicted carrying a burden of goods or performing some sort of service. The proffered goods sometimes had some sort of loose affiliation with Africa or with tropical colonies more broadly. Coffee, for instance, is a product of the tropics from East Africa as well as other places. And this ad for Zelig's Ersatzkaffee, which is actually made from chicory, is striving quite hard to make this notional Africa coffee connection. But other times, products with like beer or office supplies or accordions, there's not an obvious connection to Africa or to the colonies at all. In many cases, however, the figure is explicitly depicted in a tableau of subordination that might be thought of as colonial, in the sense the figure was burdened or laboring to carry goods to the viewer, as with this advertisement from Universal Coffee from 1904. Now, the spread of this motif in the emerging world of German advertising right around the turn of the century is somewhat curious. We might immediately suspect that the African figure's growing ubiquity in Germany holds some sort of relationship to Germany's actual colonialism in Africa. Some of you might know that Germany's foray into overseas imperialism began in 1884 and 1885 when the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck declared some coastal regions of West, Southwest, and East Africa to be under the protection of the German Reich. And Germany thus acquired colonies in Togo and Cameroon and Southwest Africa and in East Africa, and in some island chains in the Pacific as well. And the imperial German flag was duly and symbolically hoisted over a few scattered coastal villages. However, while the new status as a colonial power resulted in a brief surge of interest in the commercial press in Germany, this particular illustration comes from a middle-class leisure and entertainment magazine. The interest of the mass media and the interest of the public in Germany very quickly waned. The colonies were not as interesting to the public as one might have suspected. So by the time these types of figures appeared, hawking tobacco, hawking coffee, the German colonial empire in Africa was more than 15 years old, and these images can't be simply traced directly to Germany's new geopolitical position as a colonial power. Just as importantly, the increasing prevalence of African natives in commercial imagery was not connected to any sort of increase of raw materials coming out of Germany's protectorates. The German colonies would remain economically marginal and a drain on the national treasury up until they were lost to Britain in the outbreak of the First World War. Around 1900, for example, the entire output of the German colonial empire produced less than 0.5% of Germany's total imports. So tropical commodities for like tea or coffee actually come from the international commodities market. They don't come from Germany's colonies. Neither did this new prominence of the African figure rate to the domestic politics of colonialism in Germany. From the 1880s onwards, Germany did have a large, well-organized pressure group, the Deutsche Kolonialgesellschaft, and it was devoted to lobbying for the expansion of Germany's overseas claims, sort of like the NRA, but for colonies rather than guns. But these organized colonial activists were clubbish, they're die-hard monarchists. They move in very different circles from the mainstream of the German business world. And as cultural conservatives, they're by and large suspicious of the emerging world of mass-marketed advertising. They felt advertising was a blight on the landscape, that it appealed to the wrong sorts of persons, that it distracted citizens from nobler, higher nationalistic pursuits. Indeed, conservatives were suspicious of visual advertising because visual advertising was new. Over the previous century, it's true, woodcuts, copper-plated engravings, these were dropped in alongside the typeset of pages classifieds to offer an illustration of the product. Here we see an ad page from 1967, includes an illustration of a sewing machine. But only in the last decades of the 19th century do we really begin to see the true mass-produced, visually oriented advertisement. What's particularly innovative about this visual appeal is the way it framed its primary message in imagery rather than in textual declarations. Notice, for example, how in this ad page from 1897, the large image of the bicycling woman dominates the page, conveys not just new sensations, we see the movement of the spokes, for example, but inscribes new meanings for the product. Meanings laden with notions of gender, notions of class, notions of modernity, meanings conveyed entirely through the image alone. This new visual advertising circulated images of single white women, of maternal figures, of cherubic children, but increasingly of African natives. The first two are less perplexing than the third. There's a whole array of factors, my book argues, contributing to the growing popularity of the African native as a motif. Advertisers borrowed imagery from Imperial Britain. Advertisers were trying to draw upon the excitement of warfare, and most of the warfare going on at the time is colonial warfare. So there's all sorts of ways that African figures are coming into the purview of advertisers. I can't go into any of them. One I just want to mention is the font for German advertised visions of Africans were the Völkerschau. These were these touring exhibitions of native peoples. Most famously, Karl Hagenbeck organized these troops. By the mid-1890s, troops from Africa had begun to circulate in Germany and Europe, and they were performing for larger and larger crowds. Now, these African shows capitalized on current events. French colonial troops attacked the kingdom of Dahomey in 1890 and faced female warriors there. And thereafter, troops of Dahomey and Amazons toured Germany and toured Europe, and the promotional materials for these Amazon shows tended towards the dramatic, increasingly presenting titillating primitivity or even shocking savagery to boost ticket sales, of course. German advertisers, for their part, sought to capitalize on the popularity of these African shows. In one example, a turn-of-the-century ad by the mouthwash manufacturing giant Odell was part of Odell's Available Everywhere campaign. Odell's a very well-funded and early sort of pioneer in German advertising. Here, the designer cleverly illustrates the abstract concept of everywhere by embodying the distant land as a native of that land. So Odell's personification of Africa clearly draws from a Völkerschau poster by Christian Bedel's for the Amazon shows. And Bedel's own poster, rather surprisingly, comes actually from a photo of the African performer herself, Amzan Queen Goma, that circulated in the Show Business magazine. In short, the popular shows of African savages in the 1890s were a cultural happening in Europe, throughout Europe. And as such, they were one important inspiration for advertisers. Advertisers around 1900 in Germany were taking note of how sensationalized presentations of Africans on chromolithograph show posters captured public attention. But The goal of advertising is to extol the commodity, not just capture attention. And for advertising after 1900, began to develop its own visual syntax. In the process, we see the aggressive representations of figures of Africans fade from German advertising to be replaced by a more generic, more standardized, more typified primitive African. Again, why? One of the most critical elements behind the social prevalence of the colonized African primitive, I would argue, is the way the motif itself allows for a particular construction of visual power, namely the means by which to establish the supremacy of the product in the visual field. In the new world of advertising, the figure of the African primitive, the typified native, allowed for the simultaneous construction of two different hierarchies. One hierarchy hides the other. The advertising tableau highlights the superiority of the product by juxtaposing against a human figure. It creates one hierarchy, if you will, a hierarchy of scale. At the same time, these operations of visual power are displaced onto an obvious other, whose otherness is obvious because of the figure's typifying pictorial conventions that describe the figure are becoming increasingly standardized in mass culture. Let me just demonstrate that point with a close reading of one of the images that open this talk. This is the tobacco snuff ad from 1902. In this ad, the African native expresses amazement at the wonders contained within the box of tobacco snuff. The slogan reads, I snort only genuine Kirchenreuter Glashütten snuff from Wünschhüttel, which you can't say that 10 times fast. The larger story of the native transfixed by the products of European technology, that's an old story. We see that in the European-wide literature of exploration in the second half of the 19th century. We see it in Henry Morton Stanley's travelogues. We see it in stories of cargo cults of the South Pacific. The difference here is it emerges visually. The African native is actually shown transfixed by the power of the modern commodity. A crucial element of this design is the manifest awe of the native, meant to pique our initial curiosity, meant to get us to follow the eyes and the reaching arm of the human figure to the crate and to the brand name. Thus, the superiority of the commodity is established in the optical plane. This is actually a standard rounded snuff box, the kind that just sort of fits very small into your vest pocket. Here, the box is enormous. Rather, the African figure is Lilliputian by comparison. So you can see how important this commodity is because the packaging dwarfs a human figure. Other pictorial techniques reinforce this optical centrality. The figure is behind the snuff box. The figure almost seems to curve around the commodity. At the same time, however, the visual power that exalts this commodity is masked by the typification within the illustration. You, as the German viewer, can rest assured that you are not being diminished in stature relative to the commodity, for the figure is drawn with the markers of the African primitive, the colonized inferior. The striped colonial shorts, the lack of any other clothing, the tribal jewelry, which feminizes the figure, at least according to European standards at the time, the bare feet. The ultimate arbiter of Western civilization is always the shoes, and depicting the figure with bare feet is very significant. So here's a crucial point. By drawing the figure as a standardized African primitive, the figure effaces its own instructional imposition. When you first see this ad, the text and image together instructs you to the supremacy of the brand. But this visual didacticism is simultaneously displaced onto an unmistakable social subordinate. So the visual didacticism, so even if you were ignorant of this ad's knowledge, the knowledge it's giving you, that the snuff even existed just milliseconds before, you as a civilized German can still chuckle at the awe of the primitive who's still captivated by the newfound wonder. So the visual power in the tableau therefore strives to instantaneously convey knowledge and at the same time give viewers pleasure from imagining they'd already possessed that knowledge in the first place. As the profession of advertising gained legitimacy, its practitioners could take ever more aggressive stances. The advertising writer Ernst Growald, in his 1904 classic on poster advertising, moved away from his predecessor's call for good taste, that advertising should uplift the German people. And instead, Growald insisted that the portrayal on the poster must be so graphic that the meaning forces itself upon the spectator to lastingly imprint itself. Advertising's modus operandi was becoming ever more forceful. First, seize the attention of the passerby. Next, press information on the viewer. In the process, prove the supremacy of the product, the commodity in unmistakable visual terms. And finally, in the same pictorial stroke, flatter the viewer. Take, for instance, this 1905 ad for margarine made with palm oil. In it, the small black figure plays a crucial role in authenticating the product. This is the new palmine packaging. Beware of imitations. So the visual composition works on a number of levels. First, the figure is drawn as a standardized typified African primitive. Small waist wrap preserves modesty. But the figure is otherwise unclothed, the feet are bare. The lack of clothing, especially of shoes, shows the primitive nature of the native waiting patiently to be civilized. This childlike African primitive points out the commodity's tropical bona fides. Beware of imitations, the figure warns us, certifying the brand by literally pointing to it. The advertising figure, in short, is acting with authority. The child's gaze is at the viewer. The finger directs us where we should look. The figure is commanding our attention, directing our gaze, pressing claims upon us to heed, to beware of imitations, to purchase. Palm oil is, in fact, a very new commodity in Germany at this time. It really only starts to circulate in Europe in the 1870s. It really only becomes widespread in Germany in the 1890s. So the passing viewer, German viewer, would have to have their attention captured in order to instruct him or her that this product actually even existed. The product, again, is magnified in the visual field. These are, palmine is it's about the size of a butter stick, right? So again, it's magnified spatially compared to the figure. But again, the subordinate role implied by the figure's status as a primitive effaces the power of the advertisement itself. No offense at the didactic imposition can be taken because depicting the African as childlike draws the viewer into a flattering paternalism. The half-naked African child is clearly the one in need of aid, of clothing, of education, of civilization. Viewers may not even recognize the information in the ad as in fact being pressed upon them, since it comes from a figure that is visibly constituted as an inferior. Now, today's era of advertising over saturation, well, we hardly recognize that advertising is, in fact, an imposition. But in fin de siècle Germany, when advertising was startlingly new, it faced all manner of opposition, from class snobbery to moral crusaders for public decency to landscape preservationists. This type of ad actually found great acclaim, circulated widely in advertising journals, because it masterfully effaces sort of the functioning of the ad, the imposition of the ad itself. You may have noticed in this image the particular emphasis on the figure's white lips, to a lesser extent oversized ears, large forehead. I've not really talked about race as it was represented through the exaggeration of facial and bodily features. In brief, patterns of racialization in German culture follow a slightly different trajectory than the emergence of the African native that I've talked about. The racialization of black figures, facial and bodily features, with exaggerated lips, emphasis on head shape, bumpy heads, emphasis on staring eyes, oversized ears, that sort of thing. This becomes ubiquitous in Germany after 1905 and almost obligatory in depictions of Africans by 1910. Traces back to all sorts of different sources. 3 chapters in my book talk about this. I can't even begin to go into it. But one thing I just want to hint at, there's the traditions of German caricature, of course. There's the war in Southwest Africa. But one thing I just want to throw out is the transatlantic influence of the minstrel show. German advertisers in the 1890s draw pictorial racialization from American commercial visuality and graph them and use them to advertise sort of modern American products like the bicycle because of its association with the United States as of modern America. And then they only graph these racial techniques onto Africans a decade later. Well, that's taken as far afield. The point I want to leave you with today is that the typification of the African primitive as a subordinate or immature inferior comprises a sort of visual form of colonial power, a colonial rule constructed in Germany for German consumers. Scholars have long recognized that colonialism is fundamentally about power. What's often less realized is that pictorial advertising is fundamentally about power as well. With a new arsenal of printing technology at their disposal, the new professional advertisers stood ready to deploy a growing array of tactics to convey commercial messages, not just efficiently, but forcefully, yet in ways that would provoke the least outcry. Typified images of subordinate, immature African primitives, in particular, offered advertisers and designers a perfect means to an end, namely the opportunity to present graphic configurations of power, but then to simultaneously mask those operations of power by displacing them onto a primitive other. Indeed, advertising's particular construction of colonial rule in the visual realm proved adept at wrapping these stark optical displays, and display that's in essence a command, and then efface the existence of that command with an inky coat of symbolic flattery. Ultimately, advertising proved unmatched at disseminating this specific vision of colonial rule to a German public of enormous size and social reach. The most widely disseminated visions of Africans in Germany emerged not as a product of the colonial economy, nor as of its geopolitical position, but as a core element in the visual imagining of Germany's consumer society. So the colonial empire that Germans actually saw, like the one that the Europeans actually saw, was designed for them by advertisers and graphic designers with commercial aims in mind. And for Europeans and Germans in specific, this had a large enduring implications for national, racial, and cultural identity.
I think it's sort of fitting that I'm here presenting at the end of this one, because in a sense my topic is sort of the combination of some of these sort of global colonial things and nation-state building, especially colonialism. But now, in a sense, we see some of these trends no longer in maybe in sort of the Western, the sort of obvious Western dominance of before, but a more different kind of dominance that's maybe not so much Western-based, but equally powerful in many ways and global. And just to also add parenthetically, my main focus is more or less urban design. As a PhD student, I got very interested in some of the new scholarship coming along and thinking a little more broadly about the built environment, sort of on many scales, and going beyond sort of the traditional bounds of urban design. I got interested in infrastructure. I'd always been interested in transportation and urban planning. I got interested in globalization, and so this is to some extent the result of that. So let me begin. Oh, and also, I only have 6 images, so it's not gonna be, sort of as visually impressive as most of the others. This will be a little more text-based, but I hope you can all keep up. And the images, I think, will help. Okay. The shipping container is a large steel box of generic and banal appearance whose impact has been revolutionary, as it plays a key role in the efficient, fast, and cheap movement of freight on a global scale. The unparalleled extent of worldwide commerce today, with far-flung globalized manufacturing and supply chains, simply could not exist without containerization. A seemingly ordinary object, the container's importance is not due to any obvious characteristics. Rather, its power derives from its position as an entity of standardized dimensions and physical qualities that functions within the transportation infrastructures of shipping, trucking, and railroads. The container is designed to fit into and be carried by these existing modes of transportation, rather than replacing them or imposing wholesale change. While the significance and intentions of some designed objects are boldly evident, the container is typically scarcely noticed in the background, even as it exerts a quiet revolution through its presence in infrastructural systems all around us. Its influence is subtle, created through standards, bureaucracies, infrastructures, and typical practices, as opposed to iconic forms or groundbreaking technologies. This paper is drawn from research of my ongoing dissertation, which examines how the domestic freight transportation infrastructure of the United States has been effectively globalized by the presence of the shipping container. The contemporary shipping container was essentially invented in the 1950s in North America, and then institutionalized as a global standard by the ISO during the 1960s. Its use boomed in subsequent decades to the point that the object has become virtually ubiquitous today. Standardization being intrinsic to the container's success, its fittings, details, and physical characteristics are always the same, and only a few sizes exist. The most widely used container, of which we see an example right here, a particularly beautiful example, is 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 8 feet 6 inches high, though a few other variations are also common. What has made the container so indispensable is that it eliminates the need to unload and reload cargo. Instead, the container itself is shifted between transportation modes, such as from ship to truck, from truck to train, etc. This leads to massive gains in efficiency and speed, tremendous reductions in labor and expense, and significantly less damage and theft. Where each transition between infrastructures formerly represented a major undertaking with much cost, labor, and time involved, the container minimizes these factors and makes the transitions nearly seamless. This has the greatest impact at ports, and containers are indeed most widely used to carry goods whose transnational journeys include an ocean voyage. And that's probably what many of you sort of associate it with. As my scholarly identity lies in the field of architecture, the role of space and materiality is crucial to how I look at infrastructure. I seek to examine the built physical world. Scholars in architecture and urban design have recently begun to pay more attention to topics of infrastructure, standardization, and regulation, highlighting the importance of these factors once viewed as mundane. This has been a significant shift in interest, crucial for a field more often drawn to compelling objects and spaces while ignoring the underlying factors that shape the built world. Key figures in this new wave of scholarship include Keller Easterling, Aron Ben Joseph, and Carol Willis. And just to add as a side note, the book by Carol Willis, Form Follows Finance, probably many of you are familiar with it. I just think is a fantastic book and a wonderful sort of part of all these dialogues, and just a terrific book. And of course, it deals with sort of skyscrapers and early skyscrapers in New York City. Also, sort of from outside architectural scholarship, Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin. It's not really about buildings and architecture so much, but it deals with a lot of these issues, and it's just a phenomenal, really groundbreaking book. Some practicing architects and urban designers are also showing a desire to engage with regulatory, technical, or bureaucratic factors and with infrastructural systems. All this has led to a greater understanding of the formative role of infrastructure, regulations, and standards in the creation of buildings, urban settings, and the built world in general. Working along these lines, I have found a helpful concept to be the spatial regime. As I define it, a spatial regime is a set of dimensions or particular physical characteristics that through standardization or common practices serves to structure our world. Such a system of dimensional standards and physical practices is interlocking and systematic at the material level, putting in place a widespread uniformity. The concept is applicable to many contexts and scales. The expected dimension of a water pipe, the mandated width and height of a doorway, the typical layout of a Walmart store, these can all be regarded as spatial regimes. These systems and standards can be the result of government regulations, engineering standards, bureaucratic practices, business calculations, and numerous other factors. Most commonly, in fact, a spatial regime arises from a mixture of causes rather than one clear-cut reason, and historical circumstance or pure contingency can also be crucial. And just to add parenthetically, regime here is not necessarily meant in sort of an oppressive, negative sense, but just as sort of a system, sort of as a system that does have some control and power. In contemporary architecture, urban design, and many types of infrastructure, it is surely evident that spatial regimes play a key role. That role is not always merely technocratic, for spatial regimes may possess their own political, social, or economic biases. A classic example are the bridges and overpasses on certain of Robert Moses' Long Island parkways, built with a clearance too low for buses to pass beneath, with the effect of restricting the suburban mobility of poor people and minority groups. Most spatial regimes and infrastructures obviously do not possess such an explicit agenda, but they are never entirely neutral and cannot avoid having political or social ramifications. This is all the more important because the spatial regime's power often goes unnoticed. The built world and people's lives within that world are shaped by these regimes, which gradually become naturalized with their role taken for granted. Just as a fish is not aware of the water surrounding it, so the frameworks and structures all around us created by spatial regimes are rarely questioned or perceived. Over the past 2 centuries or so, in what we broadly regard as the late modern or industrialized era, many of the most significant spatial regimes have come into being at the scale of the nation-state. It is the role of governments and other national institutions to create standards, protocols, systems, and regulations that are applied universally across the nation-state, and many of these possess a spatial aspect. Spatial regimes are one of the many tools that help make the national territory and people into a coherent entity. The unity of national space and identity does not exist a priori, but is produced by such infrastructures, as well as numerous other projects and schemes, some physical or tangible, others cultural, social, or institutional, of nation building. A classic example, and of course the work of Benedict Anderson and some of those folks talks about some of the more cultural aspects of this, but I'm concerned more with infrastructure itself. A classic example is railroad track gauge, the distance between rails. For a railroad network to be unified with the rapid and seamless movement that rail technology makes possible, the same track gauge must be in place everywhere. In the United States, this took some time to develop, but by the end of the 19th century, the standardization of American track gauge was largely complete. Key events in the process being the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the alteration of gauges in the South after the Civil War. Other aspects of rail technology, some spatial, some not, were also systematized and standardized in this era, resulting in a nationally cohesive network. The 20th century, in turn, was a period of road building at the national scale, with the development of automotive technology and the creation of the interstate highways. Here again, a nationwide spatial regime of lane width, clearance, turning radius, grade, etc., was created, though in this case the system, the interstate highways, was envisioned virtually from the beginning as being national in its scope. In today's globalizing era, it seems that the cohesive unity of the national scale is being blurred by emerging global networks, transnational practices, and cross-border hybridities. Transformations of great significance, falling under the broad term globalization, are undeniably taking place, but the process thus far is quite different from the nation-building project of modernity. The challenge of creating transnational systems and forming standards that encompass multiple nations is a steep one, especially in a postmodern world as liable to splinter as it is to cohere. Most infrastructures and spatial regimes have become deeply embedded in the built environment at the national scale and cannot be easily altered. The new wave of worldwide infrastructures being put in place to boost global movement, communication, and trade therefore must somehow work within the existing infrastructures of nation-states rather than attempting to replace or overhaul them. The shipping container is a perfect example. While it constitutes a spatial regime put in place at a previously inconceivable worldwide scale, the container is designed to work within the existing infrastructures of the nation-state that possess their own well-established qualities and are spatial regimes in their own right. As a rigidly standardized object, the container might seem as universal and all-encompassing as any national infrastructure. It does not vary on the basis of national, regional, or local particularities. Yet by its very simplicity, the container is in fact a flexible object, able to work across so many different national infrastructures and with multiple modes of transportation. Its dimensions are meant to be amenable with the trucking and railroad systems of most nations, and of course with ships traveling over the ocean, and its fittings and other qualities make it easy to handle. This is a formula well suited to globalization, to a multiplicity of conditions rather than an all-encompassing unity. It is an ingenious spatial regime that the container implements. One way to understand it is as a, quote, second-order system. What we view as typical infrastructures, like railroads and highways, are first-order systems, and a second-order system like containerization is an infrastructure that depends on these first-order systems in order to function. Second-order systems might not fit the conventional definition of infrastructure, being strung together out of several first-order infrastructures. Yet such a system can possess a certain autonomy as more than the sum of its underlying parts. For even as containers are hauled by nation-based transportation modes for segments of their journeys, they are following longer global trajectories. Another helpful concept for grasping the role of the container is the gateway technology. Such a technology or device succeeds by serving as a connection between other technologies or systems, linking them together when otherwise they would be incompatible. A gateway technology typically has a blandness and deceptive simplicity, as what makes it successful is not so much its inherent qualities, but rather its ability to interface with other systems. Standardization is important in this, as having standards in place makes these interfaces possible. The container is a gateway technology par excellence, and its ability to serve as such is rooted in its physical qualities and especially its spatial dimensions, that is to say, its spatial regime. Perhaps its status as a second-order system or a gateway technology makes the container more likely to be overlooked. Working to link up infrastructures that already exist to act as an interface between them, the container is even less likely to be perceived than those infrastructures. If infrastructures and spatial regimes by their nature reside in the background of human awareness, then a system like containerization, existing only to connect these other infrastructures, is even less noticeable. Yet it would seem that technologies and objects that work to bridge the systems of divergent countries, as the shipping container does, possess an unprecedented importance in a globalizing world. The era of the nation-state has not ended, but is being supplemented, or perhaps eroded, by global networks and practices that bind the world more closely together. Yet they do so without achieving anything like the coherence of the nation-state. The global unity is a more tenuous matter, cobbled together out of widely varying parts, and is more advanced in some respects, like commerce, supply chains, and communication, than others such as governance, culture, and identity. To put these global networks in place, a second-order system or gateway technology is an ideal tool. While the container's success derives from its ability to work within existing infrastructures, in certain situations it does force dramatic changes. some nations have been compelled to alter the spatial regimes of their domestic transportation systems in the face of global containerization. Switzerland and Paraguay, for instance, both formally limited the width of trucks on their roads to slightly under 8 feet. But with rising container use in the 1970s and 80s, they had little choice but to loosen their regulations slightly to accommodate the container with its 8-foot width. As it has become more and more firmly established and widely used, the container has exerted itself in this way more often. National infrastructures initially were tweaked to handle it, but substantial overhauls later took place to accommodate it more efficiently. The most striking example in the US context is double stacking, the practice of carrying containers stacked too high on specially designed rail cars. When containers first entered the American domestic infrastructure, the railroads dealt with them by using normal flat cars slightly modified. But as traffic picked up over the years, the idea of double stacking emerged in the late 1970s. It was feasible on certain routes because some railroad clearances in the western parts of the country were just high enough to fit two stacked containers, provided the bottom one was held as low as possible. And just to add parenthetically, the reason for those higher clearances obviously had nothing to do with the container, because it dated back to 80 or 100 years ago. It was for other reasons that were relevant at the time. The efficiency gained by operating in this fashion is dramatic, as a stacked train obviously can carry nearly twice as many containers as otherwise possible. Starting in the 1980s and continuing to the present day, the railroad companies have undertaken massive efforts to make stacked train use possible in most of their major corridors. Many of these projects have cost hundreds of millions of dollars, all for the sake of an extra foot or two of vertical clearance. So the spatial regime of the container, of globalization in effect, has worked to transform the spatial regime of the nation state. And this would have a parallel in the earlier days of railroad gauge, when you had, again, you spent tremendous amounts of time and effort and money, to move the gauge just an inch or two to make the gauge, say, in the southeast compatible with the gauge in the rest of the country and so forth. This situation of the container reshaping American space is especially ironic because the container was, as noted earlier, essentially invented in the US. While precursors go back as far as the turn of the century, today's global container was developed in the late 1950s and early 60s in the US and adjusted slightly for global purposes in the mid and late 1960s. The container's length, width, and height all reflect the largest possible size that at that time was permitted to be moved by tractor-trailer truck throughout the nation's major roads and highways. Hence, every standard 40-foot container in the world today owes its dimensions in the most simple and direct fashion to the spatial regime of American roads and truckings in the late 1950s. And to me, that's such a sort of a fascinating fact that I almost wanted to read that sentence again. So just to think about how virtually every single container you see in the world today, its dimensions are directly coming out of North American highway sort of regulations of the late 1950s. But the container's American heritage does not mean US supremacy is permanently embedded in it. On the contrary, the export-oriented nations of East Asia have been tremendously successful in using the container for their own purposes, a trend that began with Japan in the late 1960s and is of course now exemplified by China. Furthermore, the container's provenance in American trucking no longer constitutes any sort of advantage for the United States because the nation's trucking system has significantly expanded its maximum trailer size over the years, and so the two spatial regimes of American trucking and global containerization are no longer in sync. Spatial regimes and infrastructures may exist in the background of our collective consciousness, but their impacts are profound. There is nothing striking or technologically advanced about the shipping container, yet it has played a key role in the extraordinary growth in global trade and commerce of recent decades, with powerful consequences for the corporations, workers, and consumers of many nations. Goods and freight now move around the world rapidly and almost seamlessly in a tightly woven network that could not be implemented and hardly even imagined before the container's arrival. The container is a plain and simple steel box, its appearance unassuming, yet through its role in the spatial regimes and standards of transportation infrastructure, it has brought about a quiet revolution. Thank you.